They worshiped the character, but they sacrificed the man. While Robert Reed lay on his deathbed, his body shattered by AIDS, Hollywood didn't offer him a hand to hold. They handed down a gag order. Terrified that the reality of the virus would stain the pristine Brady brand, executives chose to erase his agony from history, whitewashing his death certificate to ensure the syndication checks kept clearing. It was a final brutal act of betrayal. They let a good man die in the dark just to keep the lights on in the studio. Join us as we uncover the cold-blooded conspiracy behind the death of Robert Reed. He was born John Robert Reitz Jr. on October 19, 1932, in Highland Park, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. However, the geography that would define his psyche was not the urban sprawl of Illinois, but the rural isolation of Muskogee, Oklahoma. When he was still a child, his father, a government worker, moved the family to the South to take up turkey farming. For a certain type of American boy, a childhood spent on a farm is a pastoral idyll, a Huck Finn existence of open skies and honest labor. For Robert Reed, it was a prison. He was a child of innate, almost painful sensitivity. While other boys in Muskogee were learning to shoot rifles and drive tractors, Reed was obsessed with presentation, hygiene, and the abstract concept of sophistication. He loathed the farm. He hated the smell of the birds, the relentless dust that coated every surface, and the crude, repetitive nature of agricultural work. Friends and family from that era recall a boy who was meticulously clean, often washing his hands until they were raw, as if he could scrub away the reality of his environment. He joined the 4-H club, as was expected of boys in his position, raising calves for show. He won ribbons. He smiled for the photos, but internally he was detaching. He viewed the rural life not as his heritage, but as a condition to be cured. This early detachment is crucial to understanding the actor he would become. Reed learned very young how to perform the role of the good son. He did the chores. He attended the church services. He played the part of the Oklahoma farm boy. But in the quiet moments, he was listening to radio dramas, losing himself in the voices of actors broadcasting from New York and London. He realized that there was a world where people didn't smell like livestock, a world where language was currency and emotion was art. He determined that he would not just inhabit that world, he would conquer it. Reed's first physical escape came in the form of Northwestern University. Returning to Illinois, he enrolled as a drama major. Here, the transformation began. He shed the Oklahoma accent, adopting a more transatlantic, cultivated tone. He began to carry himself with the air of an intellectual. He wasn't just studying acting, he was studying how to be a gentleman. It was also at Northwestern that the fissures in his identity began to widen. It was the early 1950s. Homosexuality was not discussed. It was whispered about in terms of deviancy and criminality. For a man like Reed, who craved social acceptance and respectability above all else, his developing attraction to men was a terrifying flaw in the perfect persona he was building. He did what many gay men of his generation did. He tried to correct the problem through traditional domesticity. In 1954, he married a fellow student, Marilyn Rosenberger. To the outside observer, it was a perfect match. Two young, attractive drama students starting a life together. They had a daughter, Karen, born shortly after. Reed loved his daughter fiercely. That love would remain the one constant, unpolluted truth of his life. But the marriage itself was built on sand. It was not a union of romantic passion, but a desperate attempt at normalcy. Reed was trying to play the role of the heterosexual husband, hoping that if he memorized the lines and hit the marks, the feelings would follow. they didn't. The marriage dissolved in 1959. The divorce was quiet, but the lesson Reed took from it was loud and clear. He could not change who he was, but he could certainly hide it. He left the marriage with a daughter he adored and a secret he vowed to keep buried. With his personal life in shambles, he threw himself entirely into the one thing he could control, his craft. He did not want to be a TV star. He wanted to be a serious actor in the British tradition. In the late 1950s, he made a pilgrimage that few American actors dared. He enrolled at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London. RADA is not merely a drama school, it is a temple. It is the training ground of Gielgud, O'Toole, and Hopkins. The training is rigorous, stripping an actor of their ego and rebuilding them as a vessel for the text. At RADA, Reed found his spiritual home. He fell in love with the discipline of the British theater. He studied the classics, Shakespeare, Marlowe, Chekhov. He was taught that acting was an intellectual pursuit, a noble profession that held a mirror up to nature. He adopted the affectations of the British stage, refining his voice into a rich baritone instrument capable of commanding the back row of a theater without a microphone. He played prominent roles in productions of A Midsummer Night's Dream and Hamlet. He was validated by the most critical instructors in the world. When he returned to the United States, he was no longer John Reitz from the turkey farm. He was Robert Reed, a classically trained thespian who viewed himself as a custodian of high art. He believed he was destined for Broadway and serious cinema. He had no way of knowing that his destiny was an AstroTurf lawn in Studio City. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the world agreed with Reed's assessment of his own talent. In 1961, he was cast in a lead role in the CBS legal drama The Defenders. The Defenders was everything the Brady Bunch was not. Filmed in New York City, the show was a gritty, socially conscious courtroom drama. Reed played Kenneth Preston, the young, idealistic son and partner of the veteran lawyer Lawrence Preston, played by the formidable E.G. Marshall. This was the pinnacle of Reed's career. The scripts were intelligent, tackling controversial subjects like abortion, civil rights, and the blacklist, topics that most television shows of the era were too cowardly to touch. Reed was excellent in the role. He held his own against Marshall, projecting an intelligence and moral gravity that made him a critical darling. For 4 years, Robert Reed was happy. He was a respected actor in a hit show that mattered. He was living in New York, where he could quietly explore the gay subculture of the city with a degree of anonymity that Hollywood never afforded. He felt he had arrived. He had proven that the boy from Oklahoma could stand shoulder to shoulder with the giants of the industry. But in the television industry, quality is no guarantee of longevity. By 1965, the cultural tides were shifting. The earnest, black and white moralizing of the Defenders began to feel dated as the chaos of the late 60s approached. CBS canceled the show. The cancellation of the Defenders sent Reed into a tailspin. He had assumed that after such a prestigious run, the offers would pour in. He expected calls for Broadway leads, for serious films. Instead, the phone rang with offers for guest spots on forgettable procedurals. For nearly 4 years, Reed wandered the acting wilderness. He took small parts, did some theater, but the momentum was gone. The financial stability he had enjoyed was eroding. He was a working actor, yes, but he was no longer a star. And more importantly, he was an actor with a type. He was tall, handsome, authoritative, and possessed a voice that sounded like it should be reading the Constitution. He was the dad waiting to happen. By 1968, the television landscape had changed dramatically. The realism of the Defenders had been replaced by a wave of high-concept escapism. Americans, traumatized by the Vietnam War, The assassinations of MLK and RFK and the riots in the streets were turning to television for comfort. They didn't want legal dramas about abortion. They wanted talking horses, flying nuns, and genies in bottles. It was in this atmosphere of aggressive frivolity that a producer named Sherwood Schwartz began casting for a new project. Schwartz, fresh off the success of Gilligan's Island, had an idea for a show about a blended family. He called it The Brady Bunch. When the script for the pilot episode of The Brady Bunch landed on Robert Reed's desk, his reaction was visceral. He hated it. He read the lines for the character of Mike Brady, a widower architect with 3 sons, and found them insipid. The jokes were cornball. The situations were contrived. To a man who had recited the soliloquies of Hamlet and argued the nuances of the law in The Defenders, this script felt like an insult to his intelligence. "It's just a gag show," he told his friends. "It's beneath me." Reed intended to turn it down. However, the realities of the business intervened. He had been out of steady work for years. His agents at General Artists Corporation were pragmatic. They told him the harsh truth. "Robert, you need the exposure, and you need the money." They pitched it to him as a short-term gig. The logic was sound. Sitcoms like this were a dime a dozen. It would likely film a pilot, maybe run for 13 episodes, and then be canceled. He could take the paycheck, boost his visibility, and then return to the serious theater work he craved. It was supposed to be a pit stop, not a destination. Reluctantly, Reed agreed to meet with Sherwood Schwartz. The meeting was a collision of 2 different universes. Schwartz was a comedy writer from the Borscht Belt tradition. He valued a quick laugh, a sight gag, and broad appeal. Reed was a Rada scholar who valued motivation, subtext, and realism. Schwartz later recalled that Reed seemed interesting but serious. Reed was actually testing Schwartz. During the audition, Reed played the scene not for laughs, but with a straight, grounded sincerity. He played Mike Brady as a real father, not a caricature. Ironically, this was exactly what Schwartz needed. He didn't want a buffoon, he wanted an anchor. The show was going to be filled with 6 chaotic children and a wacky housekeeper. He needed a center of gravity to hold it all together. Reed's natural gravitas, the very thing that made him hate the script, made him perfect for the role. Schwartz offered him the part. Reed hesitated. He looked at the contract. It was a standard television deal, binding him to the show for 5 years if it was picked up. 5 years. It seemed like an eternity, but also an impossibility. Surely, a show this silly wouldn't last 5 years. He picked up the pen. He signed the contract. On that day in late 1968, Robert Reed didn't just sign up for a sitcom. He unknowingly walked into a golden cage that would lock him in for the rest of his life. He had sold his artistic soul for security, believing he could buy it back later. He was wrong. The ink was barely dry, and the cameras were about to roll on a phenomenon that would strip him of his identity and replace it with a perm and a smile. Filming for the pilot, entitled The Honeymoon, began. Reed walked onto the set at Paramount Studios with the air of a visiting professor forced to teach a kindergarten class. He was professional, courteous, but detached. Then he met the children: Barry Williams, Christopher Knight, Mike Lookinland, Maureen McCormick, Eve Plum, and Susan Olsen. They were just kids, loud, energetic, and inexperienced. Reed, who had always kept a distance from his own daughter due to the divorce and his work, suddenly found himself surrounded by instant family. And then he met Florence Henderson. Henderson, cast as Carol Brady, was a Broadway veteran herself. She had starred in Fanny and had a legitimate musical theater background. Reed respected her immediately. She was a professional. She was talented. And unlike him, she understood exactly what show she was on. She knew this was light entertainment, and she embraced it with a warmth that Reed found baffling but charming. The chemistry between Reed and Henderson was immediate, but it was the chemistry of opposites. She was the light. He was the shadow. She was the warmth. He was the structure. As they filmed the wedding scene in the pilot, with the chaos of the dogs and the spilled cake, Reed found himself doing something he hadn't expected. He was trying to make it work, not the jokes. He still hated the jokes, but the family. He looked at the boys, playing his sons, and felt a protective instinct kick in. If he had to be in this garbage, as he called it, he would ensure that at least the relationships felt real. The pilot wrapped. The cast went home. Reed returned to his private life, confident that the show wouldn't be picked up. He waited for the rejection call so he could get back to real acting. The call came weeks later. A BC loved it. The Brady Bunch was on the schedule for Friday nights. Robert Reed hung up the phone and poured himself a drink. The trap had snapped shut. Mike Brady was alive, and Robert Reed was about to begin a long, slow suffocation. On September 26, 1969, the Brady Bunch premiered on ABC. The timing could not have been more surreal. Outside the studio walls, the United States was tearing itself apart. The Vietnam War was raging. The My Lai massacre was about to be exposed to the public, and the counterculture movement was challenging every established norm of American life. The Manson family murders had occurred just weeks prior, shattering the illusion of Californian safety. And yet, at 8 p.m., millions of televisions flickered to life to show a story about a widower, a widow, 6 children, a dog, and a housekeeper, all living in a pristine split-level universe where the biggest problem was a missing doll or a broken vase. Critics savaged it. TV Guide called it old-fashioned. The Los Angeles Times dismissed it as saccharine fluff. Robert Reed read the reviews and nodded in agreement. He felt vindicated. To him, the critics were confirming what he already knew. The show was trash. He assumed the audience would agree, the ratings would tank, and he would be released from his contract by Christmas. He was wrong. The American public, exhausted by the nightly news footage of body bags and burning cities, did not want realism. They wanted anesthesia. They wanted the Bradies. The show didn't just find an audience, it found a devoted congregation. Robert Reed watched the ratings climb with a sense of growing dread. The garbage wasn't going away. He was trapped. As the first season progressed, a pattern of behavior emerged on Stage 5 at Paramount Studios that would become legendary in Hollywood folklore. To the crew and the writers, Robert Reed became known as the man of 1,000 memos. Reed refused to treat the Brady Bunch as a sitcom. He treated it as a documentary about an architect living in the suburbs. He brought his RADA training to bear on scripts that were written to appeal to 8-year-olds. If a script contained a factual error, a logical inconsistency, or a character motivation that didn't track, Reed would stop production. He would march to his dressing room, pull out his typewriter, and compose blistering, single-spaced diatribes addressed to Sherwood Schwartz. These were not polite suggestions. They were academic dissections of the show's stupidity. In one famous incident during the filming of an episode where the family installs a payphone, Reed wrote a memo arguing that the cost of the installation as described in the script was inconsistent with current Bell system tariffs. He had actually called the phone company to check the rates. In another instance, he argued for hours that Mike Brady, a man of science and structure, would never allow his children to build a house of cards in the living room because it violated the principles of structural engineering. Sherwood Schwartz was baffled. "Bob," he would say, "it's a comedy. The payphone is funny. The rates don't matter. "It matters to the character," Reed would roar back. "It matters to the truth." The crew walked on eggshells. They watched in fascination as this classically trained giant of a man would stand in the middle of the AstroTurf lawn, debating the physics of a scene while 6 children stood by, waiting to say their lines. Reed wasn't trying to be difficult for the sake of ego. He was trying to salvage his dignity. He believed that if he could force the show to make sense, even in small ways, he wouldn't be completely selling out his artistic integrity. He was trying to turn a comic strip into an oil painting. Despite his disdain for the material, Reed never phoned in a performance. This is the great paradox of his career. When the director called action, the angry, frustrated intellectual vanished, and the warm, wise father appeared. He took his craft so seriously that he often over-prepared for scenes that required zero preparation. There is a specific moment in season 2 that encapsulates this. The script called for Mike Brady to give a lecture to his son Greg about the importance of responsibility. It was a standard Brady speech, 3 minutes of moralizing set to soft music. Reed didn't just memorize it, he blocked it out like a soliloquy. He found the rhythm in the mundane dialogue. He used his eyes, his posture, and that resonant baritone voice to imbue the scene with a gravity it didn't deserve. He was playing King Lear to a teenager in bell-bottoms. Barry Williams, who played Greg, later recalled, "Bob taught me that you don't play down to the material, you elevate it." Reed was teaching the children how to act. Between takes, he would give them notes. He taught them about lighting, about hitting their marks, about listening to the other actor. He gave Eve Plum books on acting theory. He gave Christopher Knight advice on vocal projection. He was running a secret drama school on the set of a sitcom. But the friction with the writers never ceased. The writers began to retaliate in passive-aggressive ways. They would write scenes specifically designed to annoy Reed, slapstick moments involving spilled flour, trips, and falls. They knew Reed felt that physical comedy was lowbrow. When Reed saw these scenes in the script, he would simply refuse to do them. "Mike Brady doesn't slip on eggs," he would declare. "He is an architect." Often, the lines or actions would be reassigned to the housekeeper, Alice Therne, who was happy to take the laugh. Reed preserved Mike Brady's dignity at the cost of his own popularity with the production team. If the set was a battlefield, the off-camera moments were a refuge. Robert Reed was a man with a hole in his heart. He was divorced. His daughter Karen lived with her mother in another state, and his romantic life was a closely guarded vault of secrets. He was lonely. The Brady kids became his surrogate family. He adored them. And crucially, he didn't treat them like props, he treated them like people. In a town where child actors were often exploited or ignored, Reed was a genuine protector. During the hiatus between seasons, Reed famously took the TV kids on a trip to London on the Queen Elizabeth II. It was a gesture of immense generosity, but also a glimpse into his world. He wanted to show them his London, the theater, the history, the sophistication. He was trying to mold them, to introduce them to the culture he loved, perhaps hoping to save them from becoming just Hollywood brats. Christopher Knight recalled a moment during that trip where Reed took him aside to teach him how to properly use a complex array of silverware at a formal dinner. It wasn't a lecture. It was a father teaching a son how to survive in the world. "He was more of a father to me than my own dad was," Knight would later say. But there was always a glass wall. Reed would be warm, funny, and engaging, and then suddenly he would withdraw. He would retreat to his cabin or his dressing room and shut the door. The kids sensed it. They knew there was a part of Bob that was off limits. They didn't know the word gay in the context of their TV dad, but they knew there was a sadness there, a secret that he was terrified they would discover. Reed was terrified that his affection for the boys, Greg, Peter, Bobby, would be misinterpreted. He was hyper-aware of the optics. He never hugged them too long. He never was alone in a room with them with the door closed. He policed his own interactions with a paranoia born of the era's prejudices. He loved them, but he loved them from a safe, agonizing distance. It was the early 1970s. The Stonewall riots had happened in 1969, sparking the gay liberation movement, but Hollywood was still decades behind. The studios operated on a policy of don't ask, don't tell, and for God's sake, don't get caught. Reed was a leading man. Leading men slept with women. That was the product being sold. If the audience found out that Mike Brady slept with men, the illusion would shatter, the ratings would plummet, and the studio would lose millions. Reed lived in constant fear of the outing. He avoided gay bars in Los Angeles, preferring to drive to obscure locations or wait until he was in New York or San Francisco. He developed a system of signals and codes. He was a master of the beard, the female companion brought to public events to simulate heterosexuality. He would often take Florence Henderson or other female friends to premieres and parties. They would hold hands. They would smile for the cameras. The captions would read Robert Reed and guest. It was a performance more exhausting than anything he did on stage. There is a tragic anecdote from this period involving a dinner party. Reed was hosting a small gathering at his home. He had invited some of the cast and crew. Before they arrived, he went through his entire house and removed any object, book, or piece of art that might be construed as too gay. He replaced art books with sports magazines. He hid his classical records and put out generic pop albums. He desanitized his own sanctuary to pass an inspection that only existed in his head. He was acting 24 hours a day. The one person who saw behind the curtain was Florence Henderson. Florence was street smart, savvy, and incredibly perceptive. She realized very early in the production that her TV husband was gay. She didn't care. In fact, it made her love him more. She saw the pain he carried. They developed a routine. On set, they were the perfect couple. They had a chemistry that was palpable. They held hands, they exchanged looks, they touched comfortably. It worked because it was safe. Reed knew Florence wasn't trying to seduce him, so he could relax. He could play the romantic lead without the panic of actual sexual expectation. Off camera, Florence became his protector. If a director made a crude joke, Florence would shut it down. If a journalist asked a probing question about why Reed wasn't remarried, Florence would jump in and steer the conversation. There is a story that during the filming of a romantic scene, the director shouted, "Cut! Bob, can you kiss her like you mean it?" Reed stiffened. He felt exposed. Florence immediately grabbed Reed's face, planted a massive comical kiss on him, and cracked a joke that broke the tension. She diffused the bomb. She was his safety net. But even with Florence, Reed rarely spoke the words. To say "I am gay" out loud was to give the secret power. They danced around it. It was an understanding, a silent pact of mutual support. She gave him the acceptance he couldn't give himself. However, acceptance from a friend wasn't enough to quell the internal storm. By the third season of the Brady Bunch, the cracks were beginning to show. The cognitive dissonance of being a high-minded artist trapped in a lowbrow sitcom, combined with the stress of living in the closet, began to take its toll. Robert Reed started drinking. It started socially, a way to unwind after a day of arguing with Sherwood Schwartz. But soon, the scotch became a necessity. He would drink alone in his dressing room after the rap. He would drink at home until he passed out. Alcohol was the only thing that turned off the voice in his head, the voice that told him he was a failure, a fraud, and a deviant. It numbed the shame of walking onto a set where he had to pretend to be excited about a potato sack race. It blurred the edges of his loneliness. The cast began to notice changes. He was never drunk on camera. His professionalism was too ingrained for that. But his lunch breaks became longer. He would return to the set smelling of mints and mouthwash, his eyes a little glassier, his temper a little shorter. The man of 1,000 memos was becoming the man of 1,000 regrets. The tension between Reed's artistic pretension and the show's absurdity reached a boiling point in the final season over something incredibly trivial: hair tonic. The script for the episode The Hairbrained Scheme called for Greg Brady to buy a cheap hair tonic that turns his hair bright orange right before graduation. Mike Brady, seeing his son's distress, investigates the tonic and, through a series of mishaps, ends up with orange hair himself. Reed read the script and snapped. He marched into Sherwood Schwartz's office. "I am not doing it," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "I am a graduate of the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. I played Hamlet. I will not dye my hair orange for a cheap sight gag." Schwartz argued that it was funny, that the audience would love it. Reed stood his ground. He presented a memo detailing why a successful architect would never apply an untested chemical to his own head. It was ludicrous, he argued. It was beneath human dignity. The standoff lasted for days. The production was stalled. Finally, Schwartz, fed up with 5 years of memos and lectures, made a decision. "Fine," Schwartz said, "we'll rewrite it." They rewrote the ending. Mike Brady would not appear in the final scene. The show would go on without him. Reed thought he had won a victory for artistic integrity. In reality, he had just written his own exit. He didn't appear in the episode. It was the series finale. Robert Reed, the father of the family, was absent from the final curtain call of the show that defined him. He walked off the Paramount lot believing he was finally free. He thought the nightmare was over. He thought he could finally go back to being a serious actor. He had no idea that the Brady Bunch was not something you could quit. It was a phantom that would follow him, haunt him, and ultimately define him, no matter how fast he ran. The cancellation wasn't an end. It was the beginning of an afterlife in syndication that would freeze him in time forever. Robert Reed walked out of Paramount Studios and straight into a wall of silence. The phone didn't ring with offers for The Godfather Part 3 or a revival of King Lear. It rang with offers for game shows. It rang with requests for Mike Brady to appear at supermarket openings. He had underestimated the power of the medium he despised. Television is an intimate invader. For 5 years, Robert Reed hadn't just been an actor on a screen. He had been in people's living rooms while they ate dinner. He was furniture. To the casting directors of Hollywood, he wasn't Robert Reed, the RADA graduate. He was the dad. And you don't cast the dad as a villain, a lover, or a murderer. You don't cast him at all because the moment he walks on screen, the audience sees the AstroTurf lawn. To make matters worse, the Brady Bunch refused to stay dead. In 1975, something unprecedented happened in the television industry. The show, which had been a modest hit during its original run, exploded in syndication. Local stations across America began airing reruns at 4 p.m., right when kids came home from school. Suddenly, a new generation, Generation X, was indoctrinated into the cult of Brady. The show became a cultural monolith. It was on every day in every city. Robert Reed's face was ubiquitous. He couldn't walk down the street in New York, London, or Tokyo without someone shouting, "Mike," or asking where Carol was. For Reed, this was a living nightmare. He was trying to shed the skin of the character, but the culture was supergluing it back onto him every single afternoon. He referred to the show as a mauled distribution of energy, a polite way of saying it was a cancer on his career. He stopped watching television. He refused to keep a set in his living room. He tried to pretend the phenomenon wasn't happening, but the checks kept showing up in his mailbox, residuals that paid for his lifestyle but mocked his ambition. In 1975, in a frantic attempt to shatter the Mike Brady image with a sledgehammer, Reed accepted a role that was shocking for its time. He guest starred in the drama series Medical Center. The episode was titled The Fourth Sex. In it, Reed played Dr. Pat Caddison, a renowned physician who reveals a devastating secret. He is a transgender woman preparing to undergo gender affirmation surgery. In 1975, the concept of being transgender was almost completely misunderstood by the general public, often conflated with psychosis or perversion. For America's Dad to take on this role was a career suicide mission. It was a scream for help. He was effectively saying, "Look at me. I am an actor. I can play complex, tortured, controversial human beings." And he was brilliant. Reed's performance in the episode is heartbreaking. He played the character with immense dignity, vulnerability, and a quiet sorrow that seemed to channel his own hidden struggles with identity. He stripped away the Mike Brady armor and exposed a raw nerve. The industry actually took notice. He received a Primetime Emmy Award nomination for the role. For a brief moment, he felt validated. He had proven his point. He had shown the world he was more than a sitcom dad. But Hollywood is a cruel mistress. The acclaim for Medical Center didn't lead to a career renaissance. The stigma of the Brady role was too powerful. The nomination was a nice pat on the head, but the scripts that followed were still generic. The industry saw the stunt, applauded the effort, and then went right back to viewing him as the man with the 3 boys and 3 girls. If Medical Center was the high point of his post-Brady struggle, 1976 brought the absolute nadir. A BC, drunk on the syndication ratings, decided to bring the family back, but not for a sitcom. They wanted a variety show. They hired Sid and Marty Krofft, the creators of H.R. Pufnstuf, to produce the Brady Bunch Hour. The concept was fever dream insanity. The Brady family would move to a new house, live in a glitter-filled studio, and host a variety show with guests like Farrah Fawcett and Milton Berle. They would sing disco. They would dance in swimming pools. They would wear sequined jumpsuits. When the offer came in, Robert Reed was appalled. He had hated the sitcom for being unrealistic, but this was a hallucination. It was everything he loathed about show business, tacky, cheap, and humiliating. He initially said no, an absolute, definitive no. But then the manipulation started. The network told him that if he didn't do it, the show wouldn't happen. And if the show didn't happen, the kids, Barry, Chris, Mike, Maureen, Eve, and Susan, would lose out on a massive payday. Reed was trapped by his own heart. He knew the young actors were struggling to transition into adult careers. He knew they needed the money and the exposure. He looked at them not as co-workers, but as his charges. "I can't let them down," he told Florence Henderson. So the Shakespearean scholar put on the sequence. The result is widely considered one of the worst television shows ever made. Watching the Brady Bunch Hour today is a study in human misery. You can physically see the pain in Robert Reed's eyes. While the rest of the cast is grinning and high-kicking to shake your booty, Reed is stiff, awkward, and sweating. He is singing, but his soul is clearly leaving his body. Ironically, Reed was the only member of the cast who had actual vocal training. He could sing, but the material was so beneath him that he seemed paralyzed. He was a man being tortured, and his torture was being broadcast to millions. The show was a disaster. It was canceled after 9 episodes, but the damage was done. Reed had debased himself for the sake of the family, and the industry laughed. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the tension in Reed's private life tightened like a noose. He was now a middle-aged man. The casual, anonymous encounters of the 1960s were becoming riskier. The gay community was becoming more visible, more political. The Castro clone look was in, mustaches, flannel, denim. Reed was attracted to this masculine aesthetic, but he couldn't participate in the culture openly. He bought a new home in Pasadena, far away from the prying eyes of West Hollywood. He turned it into a fortress. He was obsessed with privacy. He stopped having large parties. His circle of trust shrank to a pinprick. He began to lead a compartmentalized existence that bordered on the schizophrenic. There was Bob the actor, who was professional, aloof, and asexual. And there was Bob the man, who would disappear for days at a time, visiting gay resorts or traveling alone. The fear of the tabloids became an obsession. The National Enquirer was growing in power, paying informants for dirt on celebrities. Reed knew he was a prime target. TV dad caught in gay scandal was a headline worth millions. This fear drove him deeper into the bottle. His drinking ceased to be social and became medicinal. He drank to quiet the paranoia. He drank to forget that he was nearly 50 years old, alone in a big house, hiding from the world like a criminal. In the midst of this darkness, Reed found one singular ray of light: teaching. He accepted a position as a drama teacher at UCLA. This was not a vanity project. He took it as seriously as he had taken his studies at RADA. In the classroom, Robert Reed was not Mike Brady. He was Professor Reed. He was brilliant. He taught Shakespeare, technique, and film history. He was demanding, rigorous, and inspiring. His students didn't care about the sitcom. They cared about the knowledge he possessed. For a few hours a week, Reed was the man he had always wanted to be. He was respected for his mind. He was shaping the next generation of actors, passing on the lineage of the British theater. He was tough on them, just as his instructors had been tough on him. There are stories of Reed staying late to help a struggling student with a monologue, of him buying books for students who couldn't afford them. In the classroom, he felt useful. He felt real. But eventually the bell would ring. The class would end. He would walk out to the parking lot, get into his car, and drive back to the lonely house in Pasadena. The professor would vanish, and the dad would return to his cage, waiting for the phone to ring with another offer to play a caricature of himself. He didn't know it yet, but the final act of his tragedy was approaching. The 1980s were about to bring a darkness that no amount of acting could hide. The gay plague was creeping into Los Angeles, and the walls of his fortress were about to be breached by a biological enemy that didn't care about ratings, contracts, or morality clauses. The 1980s arrived in America with a blast of neon, synthesizer music, and aggressive optimism. It was the era of Reagan, Wall Street, and Morning in America. But for Robert Reed, the decade did not bring a new dawn. It brought a darkening sky. While the culture was celebrating excess and visibility, Reed was retreating further into the shadows. He was approaching 50, a dangerous age for a leading man in Hollywood, and a terrifying age for a gay man in a youth-obsessed subculture. He had hoped that the cancellation of the Brady Bunch Variety Hour in 1977 was the final nail in the coffin of Mike Brady. He had returned to the theater, touring the country in productions of Death Trap and Same Time next year. He was desperate to wash the sequin glitter off his soul with the sweat of honest stage work. He wanted to be an actor again, not a mascot. But the ghost of the Bradies was not so easily exorcised. The syndication numbers were not just holding steady, they were climbing. The children who had watched the show in 1969 were now college students watching it, ironically. The children of the 70s were now young parents, introducing it to their own kids. The show had ceased to be a television program, and had become an immutable piece of American folklore, like baseball or apple pie, and folklore demands maintenance. In 1981, the phone rang again. It was the studio. They wanted a reunion movie. The Brady Girls Get Married. Reed's initial reaction was a weary laugh. The girls, Maureen McCormick and Eve Plum, were adults now. The premise seemed absurd. He wanted to say no. He needed to say no for his own sanity. But the trap that had ensnared him in 1976 was still active. The producers knew Reed's weakness, his loyalty to the kids. They explained that this movie was a pilot for a potential sitcom, The Brady Brides. If Reed refused to appear, the project might fall apart. If the project fell apart, Maureen and Eve would lose a significant career opportunity. Once again, Robert Reed was held hostage by his own decency. He couldn't be the one to kill the family's paycheck. "I'll do it," he said, "but Mike Brady is not going to be a buffoon." He returned to the set, but he was different now. The perm was gone, replaced by a more natural, distinguished style. He was graying. His face carried the lines of a man who had spent a decade frowning at scripts. The reunion movie was a hit. It spawned the short-lived sitcom, The Brady Brides. Reed appeared in it, dutifully delivering his lines, offering advice to his now adult daughters. But viewers who looked closely could see a profound sadness in his eyes. He was playing a father who had successfully raised his children, yet he seemed more isolated than ever. There's a small physical detail from this era that speaks volumes about Reed's internal struggle: his mustache. In the early 1980s, the clone look was the dominant aesthetic in the gay community. Short hair, flannel shirts, denim, and a thick mustache. It was a hyper-masculine look adopted to counter the effeminate stereotypes of the past. Reed grew a mustache. To the casual observer, it was just a style choice, perhaps an attempt to look more distinguished like his idol Tom Selleck. But to those in the know, it was a signal. It was a way for Reed to participate in the gay culture he was forced to hide from. It was a tiny flag of rebellion waving on his upper lip. The producers of The Brady Brides hated it. They wanted the clean-shaven, safe Mike Brady of 1972. There were debates. Reed fought for the mustache. It seems trivial. But for a man whose entire existence was dictated by a morality clause, this facial hair was one of the few things that belonged to him. He eventually kept it for parts of his off-screen life, but on camera, the battle for Mike Brady's face was a constant negotiation between Reed's desire for adulthood and the studio's desire for arrested development. While Reed was arguing about scripts and mustaches, a horror story was beginning to unfold in the streets of Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco. In June 1981, the Centers for Disease Control published a report about a rare pneumonia found in 5 gay men in Los Angeles. By 1982, the whispers had turned into a scream. Men were dying. Young, healthy men were wasting away, their bodies covered in purple lesions called Kaposi's sarcoma. They called it GRID. Later, they would call it AIDS. For a closeted man in Hollywood, this was not just a health crisis. It was an existential threat. The stigma attached to the disease was medieval. People were afraid to touch doorknobs. Funeral homes refused to handle bodies. Families disowned their sons. Robert Reed watched the news with a cold knot in his stomach. He was a man who had engaged in casual sex. He knew the underground bars. He knew the bathhouses. He realized, with a terrifying clarity, that the enemy was no longer just the tabloids. It was invisible. It was in the blood, and it was hunting. He became even more reclusive. He stopped traveling as much. He scrutinized his own body for signs. A cough that wouldn't go away, a spot on the skin. The fear was paralyzing. Every cold was a potential death sentence. Every night's sweat was a cause for panic, and he couldn't talk to anyone. He couldn't go to a public support group. He couldn't march with ACT UP. He was Mike Brady. If he was seen walking into an AIDS clinic, the story would be on the front page of the Inquirer before he even filled out the paperwork. He was trapped in a glass box, watching his community burn, unable to scream. In 1988, the nostalgia wave crested into a tsunami. CBS commissioned a 2-hour television movie, A Very Brady Christmas. The premise was simple. All the Brady children, now adults with their own spouses in crises, return home for the holidays. It was intended to be a warm, fuzzy piece of holiday filler. Robert Reed, now 56, was contractually obligated to return. But this time, Reed decided to channel his anxiety, his fear, and his frustration into the performance of a lifetime. He read the script, and as usual, found it lacking. But there was one plot point that caught his attention. In the climax of the movie, Mike Brady, who is now a successful architect, is trapped in a collapsing building while trying to save a security guard. It was a melodrama of the highest order, but Reed took it seriously. He saw it as a metaphor. Mike Brady was trapped. The structure he had built was crushing him. The walls were closing in. Reed researched the physiology of suffocation. He researched structural engineering collapses. He prepared for the scene as if he were filming a disaster movie for Irwin Allen, not a TV movie for Sherwood Schwartz. The filming of the collapse scene is now the stuff of legend. The script called for Carol Brady and the family to gather outside the crumbled building, singing Silent Night to give Mike hope. It is objectively one of the cheesiest moments in television history, but cut to the interior of the rubble. Robert Reed is there, covered in dust, pinned under debris. He is not acting in a sitcom sense. He is playing a man facing his own mortality. His breathing is ragged. His eyes are wide with genuine terror. He portrays the physical reality of entrapment with a visceral intensity that is almost uncomfortable to watch. While Florence Henderson is outside singing a Christmas carol, Robert Reed is inside acting out a death scene that feels strangely prophetic. He's alone in the dark, crushed by the weight of the world, waiting for a rescue that might not come. When the movie aired on December 18, 1988, it smashed records. It was the highest-rated television movie of the year. Nearly 40% of the television viewing audience in the United States tuned in. For the studio, it was a triumph. It proved the Brady brand was immortal. For Robert Reed, it was a sentence. The success of A Very Brady Christmas meant that CBS immediately ordered a new dramatic series, The Bradies. They wanted more. They wanted to wring every last drop of blood from the stone. In 1989, Reed signed on for The Bradies. This wasn't a sitcom. It was an hour-long drama jokingly referred to by critics as Brady something. The tone was darker. Bobby was paralyzed in a racing accident. Peter broke up with his fiancée. The bubbly joy of the 70s was gone, replaced by soap opera angst. Reed was tired. He was visibly thinner. His face was gaunt. The makeup department had to work harder to hide the dark circles under his eyes. He was fighting a war on two fronts. On screen, he was trying to ground this ridiculous melodrama in reality. Off screen, he was fighting a private battle that he was beginning to lose. The diagnosis had come. The exact date Robert Reed received his HIV-positive diagnosis is known only to his doctors and his closest confidants. But by the filming of The Bradies in late 1989 and early 1990, the virus was active. Imagine the psychological torture. He is playing the patriarch of a family that solves every problem with a family meeting and a hug. Meanwhile, in his real life, he is carrying a virus that has no cure, a virus that society calls a punishment. He is dispensing advice to his TV children about marriage and career, while secretly wondering if he will live to see the next year. He is the strongest man on television and the most vulnerable man in Hollywood. As the 90s dawned, The Bradies was canceled after 6 episodes. The audience didn't want to see the Bradies suffer. They wanted the fantasy. Reed retreated to Pasadena. He was still teaching at UCLA, still clinging to that one shred of authentic identity. But his health was failing. The colon cancer diagnosis, which was real, came as a secondary blow to a system already compromised by HIV. He began to settle his affairs. He reached out to his daughter, Karen. He spent time with Florence. He started to say goodbye, but he did it in code. He couldn't tell people why he was dying. He could only tell them that he was tired. He had spent his entire adult life building a wall to keep the world out. Now, as the end approached, he realized that the wall didn't just keep people out. It locked him in. He was dying inside the monument he had built to his own secrecy. The architect was about to face the final collapse. The year 1990 opened with a silence that was deafening only to Robert Reed. To the outside world, he was still the recognizable, albeit aging, face of American fatherhood. The recent cancellation of the drama series The Bradies was seen as a minor professional hiccup, just another show that didn't stick. But inside the walls of his home in Pasadena, the cancellation was irrelevant. Robert Reed was fighting a war against his own blood. By this time, the HIV virus was no longer dormant. It was awake, and it was aggressive. We must strip away the Hollywood gloss to understand the physical reality of an HIV-positive man in 1990. There were no cocktails yet, no miraculous antiretroviral therapies that could turn the disease into a manageable chronic condition. There was only AZT, a drug that was essentially chemotherapy in a bottle. It was toxic, brutal, and often made patients feel sicker than the virus itself. It caused nausea, anemia, and muscle wasting. Reed took his pills in secret. He hid the bottles. He managed the side effects with a grim determination, terrified that a bout of nausea on a set or a tremor in his hand would give him away. He was acting the role of a healthy man, but his body was screaming the truth. As Hollywood began to feel more like a threat than a home, Reed poured his remaining energy into the one place where he felt safe, the classroom. He continued to teach at UCLA. For the students who enrolled in his Shakespeare courses during this period, the experience was surreal. They walked in expecting Mike Brady. They got a gaunt, intense intellectual who demanded absolute perfection. Reed was visibly losing weight. His clothes, once tailored to perfection, began to hang loosely on his frame. His cheekbones became sharper, his eyes more sunken. To his students, he explained it away as stress or dieting. He never missed a lecture. There is a profound nobility in this. Here was a man facing the most terrifying death imaginable. Yet he insisted on standing in front of a room of 20-year-olds breaking down the meter of King Lear. He was desperate to pass on what he knew before the clock ran out. He wasn't teaching for the money. He didn't need it. He was teaching to prove to himself that his mind was still alive, even if his body was failing. One student from that era recalled, he was fierce. He would get so passionate about a scene that he would be shaking. We knew something was wrong. He looked frail, but his voice was still powerful. It was like he was trying to shout down the Reaper. But Los Angeles is a small town, and secrets are its currency. By late 1990, the rumors began to circulate. They started in the casting offices and the makeup trailers. Have you seen Bob Reed? He looks terrible. Is it cancer? Is it the other thing? This was the era of the gay plague panic. Rock Hudson had died in 1985. Liberace in 1987. The pattern was familiar to industry insiders: the sudden weight loss, the flu that lasted for months, the retreat from public life. Reed sensed the whispers. He saw the looks he got when he walked into a restaurant. The paranoia that had dogged him for 30 years intensified. He stopped going out. He began to edit his life down to the bare essentials. He cut off acquaintances. He avoided phone calls. He was terrified that a tabloid reporter would go through his trash or bribe a nurse. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of the headline. He was afraid that Mike Brady would become a punchline, or worse, a cautionary tale about deviant behavior. He wanted to protect the legacy of the show, not for his sake, but for the sake of the kids, Barry, Christopher, Eve, and the rest. He couldn't bear the thought of them having to answer questions about his sex life on talk shows. In early 1991, Reed accepted what would be his final on-screen role. It was a guest spot on the crime drama Jake and the Fat Man in an episode titled It Never Entered My Mind. Watching this episode today is a harrowing experience. Reed plays a character named Alexandra. He is unrecognizable from the vigorous man who threw footballs in the backyard of the Brady house. He is skeletal. His skin is gray. The makeup department clearly worked overtime to give him some color, but they couldn't hide the skull beneath the skin. He moves slowly. There is a fragility to him that is painful to witness, yet the acting is impeccable. He delivers his lines with that trademark precision, that rat-a-trained diction. He is a professional to the bitter end. On set, the cast and crew knew. They had to know. You don't look at a man in that condition and think it's just a cold. But in the polite, denial-heavy culture of Hollywood sets, no one said a word. They asked if he needed a chair. They asked if he wanted water, but no one asked, "Bob, are you dying?" It was a conspiracy of silence, a final courtesy paid to a man who had made it clear that his privacy was more important than his life. As if the HIV wasn't enough, biology delivered a cruel second blow. In the spring of 1991, Reed began experiencing severe abdominal pain. He initially dismissed it as a complication of the HIV or a side effect of the medication, but the pain persisted. He went to the doctor. The diagnosis was colon cancer. For many, this might have been the end of hope. For Reed, in a twisted, tragic way, it was a lifeline. Cancer was a public disease. Cancer was something you could put in a press release. It provided a cover story for the deterioration that everyone could see. He told his daughter, Karen. He told Florence Henderson. "It's cancer," he said. And it was the truth. But it wasn't the whole truth. It was the truth that was safe to share. However, the doctors knew the reality. That cancer was aggressive, but Reed's immune system, ravaged by HIV, had no capacity to fight it. Chemotherapy, which destroys the immune system to kill cancer cells, is a death sentence for an AIDS patient whose immune system is already non-existent. The doctors were checkmated. There was nothing they could do. The cancer would grow unchecked because the treatment would kill him faster than the disease. By April 1991, Robert Reed knew he wasn't coming back. He made the phone calls. He called Florence Henderson. They had a conversation that Henderson would later recount with tears. She knew. She had known for years. They didn't need to say the words AIDS or gay. They just spoke about love. "I love you, Florence," he said. "I love you, Bob," she replied. It was a goodbye between two soldiers who had survived the trenches of a cultural phenomenon together. She was the only woman, other than his daughter, who had ever truly known him. He called his daughter Karen. She was the light of his life, the one person he had tried hardest to shield from his complexities. He didn't want her to see him waste away. He tried to keep her at arm's length, using the "I'm just tired" excuse. But she was his blood. She came to him. In the first week of May 1991, Robert Reed made his final journey from his home to Huntington Memorial Hospital in Pasadena. He did not check in as Robert Reed. He did not check in as Mike Brady. He used a pseudonym. The hospital staff was briefed. This was a high-security patient, no press, no unauthorized visitors. The nurses were sworn to secrecy. He was placed in a private room. The blinds were drawn. The man who had spent 30 years living in the bright lights of a television studio was now in the dark. The hospital room became a bunker. Reed was terrified that a janitor or an orderly would sell a photo of him on his deathbed to the National Enquirer. Even as his body began to shut down, his mind was racing with anxiety about PR damage control. He was dying of two diseases, AIDS and celebrity. As May 12th approached, Reed drifted in and out of consciousness. The pain was managed with morphine. The architect was dismantling the house. Florence Henderson came to visit. She sat by his bed. She held his hand, the hand that had patted so many heads, signed so many autographs, and written so many angry memos. She felt the frail bones. She saw the lesions. She saw the tragedy of it all. Here was a good man, a talented man, a kind man, who was forced to die like a criminal because his country couldn't accept who he loved. She leaned in and whispered to him that it was okay to let go, that the kids were fine, and that the show would go on without him. In those final hours, the fear in Reed's eyes began to fade, replaced by a distant, vacant peace. The fight was leaving him, and the performance was finally, mercifully, coming to an end. Outside the hospital walls, the world continued its broadcast. Somewhere in America at that very moment, Mike Brady was on a screen, smiling, healthy, and immortal, telling Greg that everything was going to be all right. But inside the room, the real Robert Reed took one final breath and then fell into silence. The director had called cut for the last time. Yet the moment that silence fell on May 12th, 1991, a different kind of script was instantly greenlit. The Hollywood machine did not offer the fallen actor dignity. It offered a cover-up. An immediate press release was issued citing colon cancer as the sole cause of death. A calculated, cold-blooded lie designed not to protect the man, but to insulate the multi-million-dollar Mike Brady brand from the stigma of AIDS. The industry was terrified that the truth would taint their wholesome asset, so they attempted to sanitize his death just as they had sanitized his life, erasing the reality of his suffering to ensure the syndication checks kept clearing. However, the deception collapsed when his death certificate was leaked, exposing the words HIV positive in cold type. Instantly, Reed's passing was transformed from a human tragedy into a tabloid sensation. The press dissected his private life with brutal efficiency, juxtaposing images of his emaciated final days against the vibrant smile of his TV persona. His funeral became a tense, divided affair where his actual existence felt like an inconvenient secret, and the mourning was overshadowed by the scandal of his exposure. The profound cruelty of Robert Reed's story lies in the absolute isolation of his final moments. The man revered as America's dad was forced to check into the hospital under a pseudonym, dying in the shadows like a fugitive to protect a reputation that wasn't even really his. He passed away clinging to the heartbreaking belief that if the world knew his true self, he would be reviled. After 30 years of providing on-screen comfort to millions, he was stripped of the right to die with his own truth, becoming the ultimate victim of an industry that demanded he sacrifice his soul to preserve their mask.